you that we remain incredibly focused on what our commercial customers desire. So that's my quick status update.
Thank you, and I'm going to mix it up a little bit. On my first question, I'm going to go to you, Sean, first, and then Will, and then over to Mitch. So the first question is, how is your vehicle going to revolutionize the status quo of access to space, and why do you believe your alternative approach is superior to traditional methods?
Could be superior. And I want to make sure, right out of the gate, we're in a design phase. This may change the whole world, and because of the fact that it might change the world, it's worth doing. So how will a Mastin XS1 vehicle change that market? The idea of a vehicle that can fly, a single airframe that can fly 10 times in 10 days is a game changer. If it is as simple, and it's never this simple, if it is as simple as gas and go, and perhaps reloading an upper stage, and being able to hit a pace of operation that is significantly different from anything that we have today. That, I think, is going to be the big change. And what it will do, even if we're not launching 3,000 pounds to orbit 10 times in 10 days, just the fact that that capacity and capability would exist at the successful completion of an XS1 program, whether it's us or anybody else, if that capability is successfully demonstrated, it then changes the math for how far in advance you might have to plan to get your assets on orbit. It will change the math, and so that's the thing that we're looking at, and how that will change the launch industry. We are not going to be doing big heavy lift, so there will still be, if the big heavy lift guys should have no fear that XS1 is going to be launching really big things. Again, we're looking at that small to medium size of the market, but just knowing that is there will then allow a lot more flexibility to both commercial and to government customers. So that's the big, I think, change that the XS1 program and our solution will provide. It also opens up a couple other options because of the fact that your vertical takeoff and vertical landing, it has a lot of flexibility to be able to go to different places and launch and land in different places. And so that opens up, perhaps as you look at the extension beyond the DARPA program, we're looking at the fact that there will be more options to get where it is you need to go in the future. So, and to the question of how is it superior, is offering an additional tool in the toolbox.
I suspect all of our answers may be somewhat similar on this, and I believe Maureen's probably would have as well if she were here. I think we're all trying to find the exact Goldilocks zone of what is the right combination of things here. To sort of echo what Sean said, there are a lot of great launch vehicles on the market already. Someone in the room could tell me, I'm sure, but yesterday was the 20-somethingest consecutive success for Atlas V. We've seen a lot of other great track records, even if there have been some recent blips. For the most part, there are great rockets on the market that work quite well, that have a price point that has proven reasonable for a fairly large block of customers. But I think what we're trying to tackle is something fundamentally different, and we're trying to serve a group of customers that haven't particularly been well served, largely because a few years ago they didn't exist. We are, what makes us a good fit, I think, for an alternative launch vehicle panel. You could say, well, we're not vertical takeoff and landing. We're not doing aerospike. We don't have this awesome zoom climb maneuver. Our vehicle looks more traditional in a lot of senses. What is alternative about it is that it is commercially developed for a commercial audience. I'm sure we'll happily sell to the US government if they want to buy on commercial terms, but we're not developing this launch vehicle for a government development program, and we're not developing it primarily to service the government. We are developing to service entrepreneurial companies. I'm happy always to have an excuse to come here to San Jose, to Silicon Valley, because this is where a lot of our customers live. Many of these are customers that were born a few years ago when the community was sort of enamored of the Falcon 1. And then when the Falcon 1 and Falcon 1E retired, found themselves looking for a launch vehicle. Others of these companies are brand new. You know, the paint is still drying on the sign on the front door. But one thing that unites them is they are building smaller spacecraft, and they want to launch them a lot more frequently because they want today's technology in orbit, not last decade's technology in orbit. And what a lot of them have found is that secondary launch opportunities, and maybe even doing a massive bundle and buying a Falcon 9 or another large launch vehicle, works really well for the case of demonstrating technology. It works really poorly for the case of building out a business plan. Sort of the analogy that I draw is people call secondary launch opportunities hitchhiking, and it turns out hitchhiking to space is a lot like hitchhiking here on Earth. You don't get to pick exactly when you leave, you don't get to choose exactly where you get dropped off, you don't get to choose what route you take. There's lots of rules about what you can and cannot do in the car. And if you're 21 years old and just trying to see America, that's probably fine. If you have somewhere you need to be and a time you need to get there, that probably doesn't work for you. You need something much more akin to calling an Uber and getting to leave when you want to leave and getting to arrive exactly when you want to arrive. And that's really what we are trying to develop. Make it so that companies that have been flying as a hitchhiker can all of a sudden be the driver of the car, can pick the orbital destination, can pick the launch site, can get out of the single file line that Mitch described very eloquently, and don't have to pay an exorbitant premium in order to do so. Pay about the rates that they're familiar with paying on secondary launch vehicles. I think once we do that, that is really an enabling technology for all the cool companies like you see here in the Bay Area, your Planet Labses, your Skyboxes, your Spires, all the other ones that are, many of whom are here in the audience. I think all of their business plans do get supercharged when they all of a sudden get a lot more ownership and authority over their right space.
The fastest growing segment of the market is the small end of the launch mass spectrum. And the primary goal of the ALASA program is to reduce the cost of space access to $1 million per flight. That's very aggressive. We have to do a lot of very different things to make that happen. Have to develop automatic flight termination systems, space-based telemetry. We have to do an almost automated orbital object collision avoidance analysis, which is a profoundly difficult project. I don't care which object I'm not going to be hit as long as I don't hit it. So we have to develop some substantially new ways of doing business. But the payoff is exactly as Will described it. You know, we first started an air-launched space launch vehicle in 1990 with Pegasus, and since then, roughly 15 generations of Moore's Law have passed. I think you could make a persuasive case that a 100-pound satellite today is as or more capable as a 1,000-pound satellite was when Pegasus was brand new. You know, maybe not, you know, the apertures don't scale the way electronics do, and you know, you could quibble over it, but I think you can have a good conversation on that subject. So ALASA is there to simplify the entire access to space problem to, you know, one instrument, one bus, one launch, one orbit, not that many people in the room, and right now on ride shares, the administrative costs alone of additional coupled loads analyses and so forth arguably exceed $1 million per flight. Someone bears those costs. Sometimes it's the primary payload provider who offers rideshare opportunities as a service to the community to foster new technology, to invest in people. But in general, it's not something they prefer to be bothered with. And of course, if the primary payload runs late or gets heavy, the rideshare stuff gets booted, which is a profound risk to take when your program, and particularly when your business plan, depends on timely access to space. Additionally, there is no affordable way to launch just one small satellite. When you have a constellation of satellites up in space, your business plan will in the long run depend on maintaining that constellation. Satellites will break. To replace a single satellite alone with a conventional launch vehicle is so profoundly expensive that you would probably instead take the risk of putting many satellites on orbit all at once so that you have a hot spare ready to move in. It's a good idea, but space is not a great warehouse. You know, the conditions are harsh, and your satellites that are spares are going to suffer the same degradation as the ones that are operational. So in the long run, ALASA is there in part to make the access to space so routine and flexible that the rideshare of the future is, here, have an Elastic, go away, you bother me, on the part of primary payload providers, rather than having to do more complicated things and longer and more detailed business arrangements.
Sean, you're obviously developing your vehicle specifically for the DARPA program, XS1. What are you envisioning in terms of ability to use this vehicle for in the future on the commercial side of the equation? And also, was wondering from the DARPA perspective with the ELASA program, have you guys been having discussions? Obviously, from the defense standpoint, you need access to space on demand and from locations that are not just East Coast, West Coast ranges. Have you started thinking about the commercial applications beyond that? And so maybe Sean started.
Sure. So the first piece of that, this is the first time that I, and the first time our organization has picked up a DARPA program of this nature. So when I talk history, I have to trust the people that have told me the history. From a historical standpoint, the objective in the XS1 program was to limit all of the conditions that have to be, try to make it as wide open as possible design space. And so the first piece of that is it's allowing us to come up with a creative solution. When we look at the business case for this DARPA program, our plan is day one launch capability. Now, day one doesn't mean the day we get the contract. That means the morning after we successfully complete the XS1 program, the afternoon after we successfully complete the XS1 program, we will be, that capability will be online and ready to serve paying customers. So that's kind of the approach is, once we've completed this program, we're going to be able to, but well before then we'll obviously have customers lined up, but we'll be able to deliver that immediately. So that's the core of our commercialization strategy. This program to us is not exploration and hey, go out there and try to solve some interesting things and then go find another project where you can mature it. It is tying the objectives that we have had for a long time to a great funding source. And I'll be honest with you, this program was a little bit earlier than what I would have, if I had to choose when this would have popped up, I would have put it a little bit further out. We have development plans. We have other orbital capabilities that were kind of on the technology roadmap. This came on a little bit sooner than I was ready for, but it didn't matter because the opportunity was there and we had to move when it showed up.
There's about a 1 second lag before these things come on, so I apologize for the awkwardness when I begin speaking. I haven't adapted yet. DARPA investment has actually been instrumental in both Virgin Galactic's and Maston's program. Virgin was a performer on the first phase of ELASA, and while their business plan for Launcher 1 wasn't 100% compatible with the ELASA program objectives, there was enough of an overlap in the Venn diagram that we had a profitable relationship working together, and I have to say that that was really productive, and I was very impressed with the quality of the people and the technical work that was done by the Virgin team. And I don't say that just to say nice things to Will. I mean, the nice thing about being at DARPA is that you can place some bets, and you can do some difficult things, and it isn't expected that you fail. I had a basketball coach in high school that said if you don't have a couple of fouls in the fourth quarter, you're probably not playing aggressively enough. And I never really liked that because it said, well, go out there and be unsportsmanlike. But the idea was that you should play aggressively and play hard, and sometimes things happen. For the commercialization story on XS1, of course, I'm going to paraphrase what I believe I have heard my colleague Jess Fonable, the program manager for XS1, say. And it's along the lines of the more successful XS1 is commercially, the more useful it is to the Defense Department, because it means that it's flown more and it can get the expensive stuff done at marginal cost. There are investments taking place in reusability kind of across the spectrum of payloads. At the minimal end, ELASA sort of reuses the F-15, so it's reusability for small values of reusability. XS-1 is meant to pick up the first 10 Mach numbers and get something between 3,000 and 5,000 pounds into orbit. That's sort of the next chunk. Commercially speaking, Falcon 9, of course, is investing in reusability at the, 15,000 pounds to orbit kind of range. I think there's maybe a gap in the middle there for something around 8,000 pounds, but something like a Delta II class level of reusability. But having said all that, the intention is very much to make the investments in reusability in the hopes that the flight rate will eventually increase to the point where commercial users drive the market, push things down to marginal cost, and then the military can use the marginal cost rides to orbit in a way that makes sense to service national security requirements.
This is the reason why I'm here and not Dave, because he would tell you right now how he's going to take the XS-1 design and we're going to spin it out in the next step and the next step and how we're going to hit 8,000. So there are plenty of plans that are out there, one thing at a time.
You okay? All right. How do you, just checking to see if you had anything you wanted to say. How do your alternative launch methods attract customers differently than traditional methods? And for the ELASA standpoint, how does it help DoD differently than what you're trying to do currently? You want to start first, Will?
Often, whenever we have our sort of internal all-hands meetings and we're gathering all of our engineers and our technicians in our new facility in Long Beach, one of my colleagues always likes to say, we're here to build a better rocket. And I always take a slightly different angle. I think we're here to build a better launch service. I think, in many ways, we're not building a better rocket. Like, we are not building a Falcon 10. We're not trying to build a Falcon 10 or an Atlas 6 or anything else. That is not the goal. The goal really is a launch service. It has that service aspect. Service is what Virgin Group does, right? Virgin Group did not design the airplanes that Virgin Atlantic flies, Virgin America, Virgin Australia. It designed the cool cabin lighting, the more comfortable seat, and the music, and all these other things that hopefully makes flying a less unpleasant experience for all of you. I think the specialness that we bring to the market, again, is that being very service-oriented in terms of being extraordinarily responsive to what our customers require, and recognizing that our customers are different than the traditional customers that have been in the market before, right? We are not flying risk class A, billion-dollar national security missions on our launch vehicle. Again, I'm sure if the government asks, we'd be happy to do it. We designed the vehicle for. We've designed it for someone much more like the Skyboxes of the world. There's a reason why when we announced this launch vehicle to the public a couple of years ago, we did have the CEO of Skybox up on stage with us rather than Charlie Bolden or whomever else it might be. So I think that we can serve the government in addition to those customers, because I see a lot of these motivations that are driving these smaller entrepreneurial customers are also now starting to be developed into reality within the government, within both NASA and the DoD community. For years now, we've been hearing DoD talk about disaggregation. We've been hearing them talk about we need to drive down the costs of launch. My observation, being someone who is relatively new to the DoD world, so I certainly welcome amendments and corrections from my colleagues up here, but my observation was I seem to be hearing those words a lot from the gentlemen and ladies who had 4 or 5 stars on their shoulder, but I wasn't always seeing those carried through at the lieutenant colonel level, and the people who are actually making a lot of the procurement decisions. I think that now, whether it's driven by sequestration and fixed or declining budgets, or it's just driven by increasing technical maturity all throughout the supply chain, I now start to see a lot more offices taking this idea of let's go fast, small, and cheap a lot more seriously. You start to see investments. I think it's so cool that NASA is doing Lunar Flashlight and NEA Scout and missions like that. They're talking about doing not just technology development, but real robust science, planetary science even, on a 3U CubeSat or whatever the smaller bus size is. I see the fact that a few years ago, it always seemed like Operational Responsive Space Office was fighting for its life and almost losing that fight. And now I feel like those ideas are starting to become a little bit more of a reality. So I hope that as those needs continue to evolve and go from a nice talking point or a nice aspirational goal to something that people are actively working on, that they're building hardware on, that they're procuring launches on, that we are bringing something to the table that is supportive of those kinds of missions.
So, on a typical episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Captain Picard sails the Enterprise up to some planet somewhere, and he looks over the planet and he says, "Launch a Class 2 probe." And some guy pushes a button and a little blip flies off the Enterprise, and Lang Lang dubs in the sound effect, and he says, "On screen." So, think about it. The guy speaks 7 words before the first commercial, and he's looking at imagery and sensor data on a targeted planet. We can't do that now. Now, okay, it's not the 24th century or 23rd century, whichever century Star Trek takes place in, I don't know, I forget. But I've watched progressing about this stuff, so please forgive me. But, we don't have, if a combatant commander says, "I'd like a satellite to fly over this particular spot on the globe because, I am deeply suspicious about what the French are up to today, this particular spot in the Rhone Valley," then his staff has to say, "Boss, we're going to have to palm for that." That means, about a 5-year process before much of anything happens. It is not going to be before the first commercial. So one of the points of ELASA is to try and make things work out so that the interval between desire and gratification shrinks to 1 day, so that the cost of putting something into space shrinks to $1 million. The $1 million is not a nice round number. I mean, it is a nice round number. It's got lots of zeros at it, 6 of them actually. They're all very round, but depending on your font. But the point of it is to drive the cost of space access down to a level that is comparable to a tactical weapons release. So when a first lieutenant in combat, according to the rules of engagement, releases 2 AMRAAMs from her F-15 to shoot down an enemy target, she spent about $1 million. A little more than that, actually, if it's AMRAAM-Ds. So, the idea of, I don't expect first lieutenants to be making on-the-spot decisions about whether to launch things into space anytime soon, though there's no reason they couldn't if there was structure and rules of engagement for that. But the idea is to push the level of resource commitment for space access down to a tactical level, so that when a combatant commander says, "I want a picture here, I want a GPS gap filler there, I'd like a new precision nav and timing source here, I'd like to get some SIGINT collection there, and fly something temporary and cheap below the ionosphere because, there's a bunch of stuff that bounces off the ionosphere from underneath that I'd really like to listen to," we can make that happen. Right now, there are always 2 guys at NewSpace that are sitting in the back of the Air Ops Center, and those fellows are generally there to pretty much hand the menu to the boss. This is allowing you to order off the menu and say, "Hey, can chef do a grilled salmon? I see it on the menu for the salad, but can you grill it?" Sure, we can make that happen for you. So that's kind of the point of ELASA. We have sort of 4 big goals: affordability, $1 million a flight, responsiveness, interval from desire to gratification being 24 hours. And the point of that is that the circadian rhythm of the Air Force in particular is the air tasking order or the joint tasking order. It's a fairly structured process, and it works on a 1-day cycle. There's flexibility, which is the ability to go down and chase the orbit you want, because with an air launch platform, you have free access to all 6 orbital elements. Rather than having to wait for the orbital track to fly over your launch site, or your launch site to roll underneath the orbital track, depending on which frame of reference you prefer, you go down and chase it and catch it, and then fire into it. And then finally, there's resilience, because really we're kind of 1 earthquake and 1 hurricane away from being out of the space launch business. And that's simply not tolerable in a country that has become as dependent on its space assets as we have. So that's kind of where ELASA is going.
I'm in such vehement agreement that I forgot the question. But I want to offer one additional point, because everything they said plus. For those of you in the audience that want to access these types of systems, the fact that this is a panel, not a presentation, is kind of the point. No matter, and there's others besides us that are looking to provide service to you to get your assets up on orbit. And so the fact that you have multiple systems that are in development, just 3 represented here, should give you great confidence, because if there was only one and you had to bet your business on someone else making good on their bet on their business, that's an awful lot of risk. The flip side is, I'm very glad that you are all out here, because it means that our business providing launch is not betting on a single customer. So I think, as it applies to how is this alternative launch idea changing the market, I just wanted to make sure to reinforce that.
That's in fact a fantastic point, because, honestly, a bunch of different people trying to do related things is a good validation of the fact that the market for such things exists, both on the payload and customer side and on the launch side. I have been to this party before. Rocket plane, of course, is about a 20-year-old enterprise that I believe the wheels have come off and then been bolted back on and it fell off again. I'm not sure what the current status is because it's way in my past. But there was a time when we all figured the teledesic winter was coming. And the sky was going to be dark with all the commercial satellites that were going up there. And there's a bunch of reasons that didn't happen. Not just with teledesic specifically, but with all the other commercial satellites. But the fact that another generation has passed, technology has improved, weights have come down, abilities have gone up. All of these things are very much confirmation, I believe, that it's time to do something like this. And whether Alassa is successful, or whether Maston is successful, or whether our absent friend Firefly is successful, or those New Zealanders with their electrically driven rocket pumps are successful, all of that is, I think, confirmation that it's probably time to do this.
So this line of conversation leads to a different question, which is, given the dramatic increase in the small sat market with OneWeb and also Google SpaceX, Skybox, why is this time different than Iridium or Teledesic? And then also what we're seeing emerging now, what are the weak points? You want to start out, Sean?
So we kind of got that teledesic winter, except it wasn't the one we were expecting. It was the chilling effect, I think, on the next market. So when I first heard that term, and again, keep in mind, I'm not a 20-year space guy. So when I first heard that term, I thought it was the chilling effect on business, not the cloud in the sky with so many satellites. Why is now different? It's a question of timing. Just because something didn't work before doesn't mean it won't work in the future. We could do the whole Newton, Apple's small device that was going to change the world and didn't, and Apple was shown how Palm was the right answer. I would argue that maybe today that hasn't changed again. But so there's a timing issue, and I believe that it's worth taking a risk that the timing is different now. It's a cost of technology. It's an application set. Those of you who are looking at bringing new data from orbit into a world that is poised and ready to handle more data is different than where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I think there are an awful lot of differences. One of the other things from the operational standpoint is, from Maston, we're able to exist in the world today because of the fact that there are so many other great advancements in technologies that we can use and adapt to what we are doing. There's sometimes a perception that everything in space has got to be space age. You have to, we get to come along and say, okay, how can I borrow, how can I use these things from another industry to help solve the problem of what we're doing in space? So that's why it's the combination of maturing markets, maturing technology, and it's not a slam dunk, but it's worth the shot.
I certainly agree with all of that. I think also it's obviously a benefit that all of our business and technical leaders today can read about teledesic in their textbooks and hopefully don't repeat exactly the same mistakes. But in addition to sort of the general trends that Sean talked about, I'm also really encouraged by the sort of diversification of the market. It's not just that there's more companies, it's more companies attempting to do more different types of things. Just as Mitchell stated so well, and Sean as well, about, this competition on the launch side is a positive sign. It means there's a market there. When I look out and I see, okay, next generation commercial weather from small satellites, okay, I'm aware of 3 or 4 companies in the United States alone that are trying to do that. Next generation imaging from small sats, okay, I'm aware of 5 or 6 companies at least that are trying to do that. They each have their own particular solution in terms of, okay, what exactly is their resolution, and what exactly is their refresh rate, what exactly are the spectral bands, and I think that that's a really positive thing. It tells me that if one of those entire sectors just gets knocked out by some terrestrial equivalent, the cell phones crushing the Iridium business plan, that will be a bad day for all of us, certainly, but okay, I've got 3 other industries that are still up there to go. And similarly, in terms of diversification, I also see this still to me quite shocking diversification in terms of the money sources that are coming into the sector. It's not just Branson and Bezos and Musk anymore. Those players are all still quite active, and as someone who's paid by one of them, thank God for that. But you all have noticed this, right? Not a week goes by now without another press release of a small sat company raises $50 million Series A round. And it's not just the same 2 venture capital shops that are backing all. It's 20 different venture capital shops. It's big equity partners. There's even some debt plays that are coming into it now. So it's like a financially feasible market now. It's starting to look like other more robust and mature industries, which is really encouraging to me.
In 2000, which I tend to think of as a space Iliad, because it didn't, lots of competition, huge personalities, lots going on. I had a wonderful conversation with a very smart woman named Rachel Villain, who works for Euroconsult in Paris. And she pointed out something about the satellite constellation market that made me realize that our expectations at that time were naive. And so let me sound a small cautionary note about this. If you are doing a geocomsat or even a GPS replacement satellite, about half the money is the satellite and about half the money is the launch. So you have an incentive to say on launch. It matters. It really adds up. In the LEO concept world, things are very different. You're entering a bunch of different businesses simultaneously. You're entering the satellite manufacturing business. Not easy. Series production of satellites is not common. You're entering the spectrum allocation business, which means you have hundreds and hundreds of regulatory agencies to talk to all over the world. Not an easy problem. You are entering the user handset business. You're entering the customer relations business. You're entering a lot of different unrelated businesses, all of which have great uncertainty as to what their costs are. If I look at the business plan for somebody building a constellation of satellites to provide some service to customers on Earth, the one part of the business plan that has very, very little uncertainty is launch. And consequently, the board of directors of such a company would be unwise to say, okay, bet the whole farm on a new launch provider so we can save, half our launch costs. That's a 5, 7, 8% savings off the top, and it's utterly swamped by the uncertainty and all the other cost elements. So if I were vetting a business plan based on a large constellation launch, I want to see that addressed thoroughly and aggressively. Because there are some things that you could say about it. You could say series production of satellites isn't the problem it used to be. We had the CubeSat revolution, for example, and I can have an engineer build a satellite on their desk. It takes a couple of days. There are parts now, there are people now, there are established engineering practices now. This is not a hard problem anymore. We're going to control the whole thing from a single ground station and relay. So we only really have to do spectrum on one place, and everything else, we can distribute over the fiber net. There are ways to address those shortcomings, but it's worth pointing out that launch has a very low uncertainty in its cost. You can even lay off the risk of losing a satellite with insurance now, and you have been able to for a good couple of decades. But the fact is that that's a small segment of the total cost of the LEO concept program, the LEO imagery satellite program, or any of the other things you do with satellites. It's generally smart to seek relatively pricing-sensitive customers for that, and of course the DoD is the ultimate pricing-sensitive customer, and I don't mean to say we squander people's money. We do, but that's not the intention. Please nobody quote me on that. Rand, oh, please, thank you. The point is that we have national security needs that have to be serviced, and we'll do what we have to because the most expensive thing in the world is the second best military. I guess
You gotta argue with yourself just for a second. As the board member looking at that plan, and you say, okay, cost is pretty well known. What about time? What about your single file line?
Well, I don't know. What do you think, Mr. Bobo? Oh, I think you're just completely wrong about that. You're right. Time has a value. And if that were the case, then I would say that incumbent launch providers are more likely to show up on time because they have shown up on time. That they're established in the market, they know how to mitigate those risks, and even the uncertainty in the single file line, yes, the NRO, if they have a big national security satellite, will roll right over you. But, I think there are ways, especially for the small solid rockets, to stay on the pad for a while without severe degradation. And consequently, I think that those sorts of payloads have probably better scoring in terms of timeliness than taking a wager on an unproven and demonstrated launcher. Once you've got the thing on orbit and in the marketplace and so forth, once the capability of saying, multi-costume mode, is something that is realistic, then yeah, timeliness matters, and it even gets down to a point where mission assurance becomes, well, we'll give you another launch if it breaks. But that's a place that you don't get to very quickly.
So for any small companies that are thinking about it, you just got 2 board members for free right there.
Well, I was just going to comment on what you said about the ventures that are moving forward. I was fairly impressed with the news release from OneWeb for I think $500 million in investor funding so far. But really scanning through the diversities of the investors and the fact that you've got companies like Coca-Cola and Airbus, and I would not try to pronounce the enterprise in India, because I'm afraid I would not do the pronunciation justice, but ground operations in Africa and Asia with that enterprise, and then also the Salinas Group in Mexico and Latin America. That was pretty impressive when I reviewed the list. So, and I know Launcher One is going to be a big part of that. So, congratulations. Does your vehicle possess, or will it possess, a unique advantage, and how is it better than your competitors? And when I say competitors, particularly if we're talking about a traditional launch vehicle where a small satellite might go on a secondary payload, that's not really what I'm referring to. I'm really talking about the small launch market and the operators that are emerging in the field right now. You want to go first, Sean?
In the prep, I said I really like a panel that has a fight, so she's been trying to get us to fight. I will tell you that the Maston position right now is that we are looking at a slightly larger payload class, and that just so happens to align with the government requirement, the 3,000 to 5,000, and anything in that either side of that is a larger payload class than some of the other new entrants that will be at the smaller end of the spectrum. The question that I don't know the answer to, but I'll be intrigued to see, will smaller satellites maintain their smaller form factor, or will there be enough demand that they're going to grow, not large size, but will there be an interest in growing? I either individual satellites or a need to grow to, in the multiples question, do they need to go up at the same time? So I don't know which market reality will exist, but one of the things that we will be able to offer is a larger mass.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I think each of us is trying to find the Goldilocks zone, right? And there's some complex equation that takes into account both absolute price and relative price per kilogram. It takes into account call-up time, ease of contracting, financial milestones, all those kinds of things. And it also calls into question sort of technical credibility and maturity, reality, as it were, of the system. And I think each of the companies on this panel, including our colleague in Essentia, Maureen, who could be here today, were each sort of diagram that was for our business plan and for our customers. It's a bit difficult to say where we'll stack up against each other because, at this point, you got 3 paper rockets up here. They're more than paper rockets because there's real hardware, there's real stage, or not stage tests, but component tests and things like that, but none of us have flown these systems yet. So in terms of comparing ourselves to the rockets that are already in the fleet, that are already active, I think the ways that any of us would be better, I hope would be the best of the better, is in terms of having some extremely strong advantages in terms of absolute price, which I agree with what Mitch said. That's not the only important thing, but it is a point of relevance, particularly to a company that is a brand new company, not a well-established company, a company that maybe doesn't have its board of directors yet because they just got started out of a garage or something along those lines. So we'll offer some advantages there at hopefully no disadvantage or a very small disadvantage in terms of the relative price per kilogram. And some big advantages in terms of that flexibility, like Mitchell talked about with ELASA, in terms of I can control all 6 of my orbital parameters because I'm air launched. I can go to different launch sites. If there's been a hurricane in Florida, or there's just boats that are hanging out of the box, or there's a radar dish that's downrange, it's offline, we kind of don't care. We just go around them or go somewhere else and move around on that. And a not irrelevant advantage in terms of a large percentage, not all of, but a large percentage of the market, is that we're a domestic launch vehicle. You don't need to hire 10 lawyers and export control and compliance officers and buy an apartment in Kazakhstan or something like that for your staff. And that drives costs. It's not necessarily just that people are patriotic and want to buy American, although that's sometimes true. It's just that drives schedule and that drives costs for customers that are quite sensitive about both of those two.
People have decided variously based on the individual strengths and weaknesses and areas of struggle in their individual teams, which chunk of the market to go after. ELASA wound up at the 100-pound class because we were sort of deliberately leading maybe a generation, maybe 2 generations of Moore's Law from where the obvious sweet spot of the market currently is. Right now, the small-ish but not CubeSat market is defined by the Esprit. Those things run 400-ish pounds. And Will's team, has a launcher one thing with a payload that's, in that range, more or less. And that means that they'll be able to point to existing customers fairly directly without having to vet a business plan with a lot of creative traffic and a lot of, if we build it, they will come, which is, of course, the field of dreams argument because the line originates in the movie at that time. ELASA is focused a little more on national security needs, so it has a bit of a different story there. So, it's, we are kind of ahead. The satellites are shrinking all the time, but there are limitations to how much of that can be done. So in the satellite design area, one of the things that DARPA is increasingly interested in as disaggregation becomes something that our military customers are more sophisticated about and more open to, is how do we combine sparse apertures into a single aperture? How do we combine individual elements into something that works maybe in the RF, maybe in the optical range? The Webb Space Telescope is going to be a 6.5 meter huge aperture in the IR, as well as the visible. And that's a very difficult problem. You have to actually put something together that can do all of that with individual mirrors, because you're not going to cast a 6.5 meter mirror in space yet. Although I actually think it'd be kind of interesting to try that in space because you've got some advantages in terms of distortions on the mirror. Sparse aperture is difficult in the optical range because you have to control like a 20th of a wavelength of light. Light wavelengths are really small. So it's not exactly easy to work to fractions of a micron. So that's something that will take some doing, but I think that's a place we'll get to eventually. You break the aperture problem, and now you've got distributed power systems, and really anything can be launched in a 100-pound payload if you can aggregate it. The metaphor I like is that the building we're in weighs many, 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 many tons, right? I mean, this is a huge piece of structure. And everything here came up Gateway Road on a truck, everything. So you can build very big things if you can aggregate individual things. And we don't have to have an optical quality aperture inside the building, so that part's fairly easy. And of course, we're using cheap materials, like concrete and carpet, and however many Malagas died to do it because so sitting on. But in the long run, it's not apparent what can be achieved with that level of technology. But I do think that having a small payload orbit capability will be one of the things that fosters that development.
Do you see alternative launch methods superseding traditional methods in reliability, cost effectiveness, and potentially market share in the future? And part of this question is also, given that we're talking about very different classes of payloads with all of you experts that have joined me on the panel, how do you think business practices and technology of what you guys are pursuing also impacts some of the traditional launch operators?
Mike's already on, so I'll go first. For some segments of the market, yes, I believe we will have a superior offer on price, reliability. I forget what the third one was. I don't believe that we are going to put the entire market. I don't think that big launch is done. There's plenty of things that this market that we're talking about will not necessarily serve anytime in the near future. So I'm not forecasting the end of anybody else. But for some segment of the market, we will have a compelling enough value proposition on those things. It may not be, strictly speaking, dollars per pound, but I do think we will have a superior offer once you factor in time and accessibility and cost and all of those things together.
Just to follow up on that.
Thought I'd get off easy. Go ahead.
So potentially superior in a variety of different areas, but also do you think that some of these NewSpace companies are making an impact on more traditional launch companies in the way that they're either pursuing technology or business practices?
Yes, I think we're seeing that. I think from what I've seen, some of the legacy companies that are currently providing access are responding to the entrance of competition even before that competition is fully up and running. So I think, yes, it will change. What will that change be? Does this mean company, no matter what letter you use, you get in trouble. A certain launch company is about ready to say, great, whatever the lowest price per pound is, that's the thing we're going to match? No, I don't think that's going to happen. But yes, the market is responding. There are offers today from existing launch vehicles that have been tuned because of the work that we're doing.
I would say that there's probably at least one launch vehicle provider that has arguably reached the end of the life cycle. I think that Pegasus launch is sufficiently seldom nowadays that a good case could be made for doing the rest of the manifest and then maybe not. But there, with a variety of launch vehicle providers, there are different things that are good for different payloads. You'll never launch a person into orbit, even a very small person, on Alaska. Not going to happen, unless maybe in pieces. Like Claude Thomas' ashes going out to Pluto, which I think is pretty cool.
Disaggregation.
Yeah, disaggregation of humans is a technology that remains well in the future. I think the biggest thing that has happened as a result of NewSpace companies, both in launch and in payloads, is that the median age of the aerospace industry has dropped. That is a huge deal because, frankly, I'm 52, and absent NewSpace, I am probably right about at the median age in aerospace, maybe below it. This is a big deal because this means that this will be a sustainable industry. It means that our profession, as a person who identifies himself as an aerospace engineer by trade, will be something sustainable. It's not like I'm a guy that makes gas lamps or buggy whips or a whaler. This pleases me, and I think it's a good long-term investment for the future of our industry.
One reason I enjoy coming to this conference is before I was an employee of a NewSpace company, I was a fan of the NewSpace industry. And I think if you told me a while ago what the future would look like, and you shared with me examples, Blue Origin working with ULA, Maston is one of the 3 prime contractors on Axis One, the stuff X-Cor's done with ULA, Lockheed Martin investing in Rocket Lab, all these other, I would probably have not believed almost any of them. I am encouraged to see that, there are some threatening signs of big legacy providers just crushing people on cost because they can afford to just take a loss for a decade until they've starved out their competition. There are some signs in that in other sectors of the industry. I don't think that's particularly relevant to us, thank God. But more than those, I see the encouraging signs. Because I think, as you all know, for the most part, people don't come to work in this industry just for a steady paycheck. There's some element of passion involved for almost all of us. And I think even at the companies with whom maybe they have a management philosophy that is not well suited to my personal pace of work or whatever else you want to call it, I think they're all excited to see Nexus One programs and Alasa programs and Launcher One programs and eager to see how they can use that to complement what they're doing. They're also noticing that what they, I think, initially wrote off as these kind of goofy side projects, it's just a guy and a gal in a garage blowing things up, and they're now starting to realize, these people actually have real capabilities. They have real seasoned veteran employees, and in addition, they have this great mix of young, fresh talent and seasoned veteran talent, and we can go and hire them. We can buy by the drink. We can have them look at lunar landings on Centaur stages and all these kind of crazy ideas that maybe they're not well suited institutionally, constitutionally almost, to take on. So I see more encouraging signs that they're learning and adapting and absorbing.
I have just a few more questions and then we'll open it up because I know the audience probably has some questions for these guys. So next question, and Will, I'm going to start off with you. What is the upside and downside to federal government programs that are intended to spur the small launch industry? And what kind of perturbations do these programs make in the market?
Yeah, great question. You probably all heard the term DARPA hard, and I usually think of DARPA hard in terms of pure technology problems, but I think Mitchell and Jess and his other colleagues have these really difficult challenges as well in terms of that exact question, right? The U.S. government, whether it's military or civil or usually some combination of the two, sees a need that's coming down the pipeline. They know that need is not currently addressable. They know with absolute certainty we need that need to be addressable in X number of years. Do I just cross my fingers and hope that the private industry does it, or do I make an active investment in it? And we, on the more libertarian, commercially oriented type of audience that I typically find here at the NewSpace conference, often find ourselves in this awkward position where we're really supportive of that as long as it's our company that's getting the investment, and we really, really hate it when it's not our company getting the investment. I will say, at some point 2 years ago, when in addition to what Virgin Galactic was doing, and obviously we were in a hybrid position as well, because as Mitchell noted, we had this very fruitful positive relationship with DARPA. But we were doing small satellite launch vehicles. There were 5 or 6 other private launch companies doing it. And then you had Alasa, and you had Swords, and you had Super Strike being all set. Like, whoa, how many bets do you need to place? And are you placing sort of 3 identical bets, or are you actually placing 3 different bets? I will say something that maybe Sean wouldn't want to say for himself, but having worked so much with the Lunar Lander Challenge, and gotten to witness firsthand the capabilities of Mastodon and Armadillo, these other companies, and then I see Project Morpheus and other things like that, and I'm like, oh boy, first of all, I'm glad that that program exists, but if you were buying that from a Mastodon, I feel like you would have gotten a lot more, a lot sooner. It's a difficult challenge, because NASA does need that capability. It does need that capability, and they can't just take Sean at his word that it's going to work, or me at my word that it's going to work, or anyone else at their word that it's going to work. But I think it's something that requires this eternal vigilance to say, okay, at some point, there's not just one company saying it's going to work, there are 10 companies saying it's going to work, and they are funded, and they have a building, and they have staff, and I don't need to be artificially manipulating the marketplace anymore. I just let the marketplace move.
In answering this question, I want to open up more than just talking about XS1 and the work we're doing with DARPA, because while at a theoretical level, I would love to be a fully commercial business that sells to the government completely on a commercial basis, the fact of the matter is, for a small company in this market right now, we do an awful lot of work with government. So downside and upside. The downside is, and I'm going to frame this not for the seasoned veterans, but if there's any aspiring or new entrepreneurs in the room, I'm going to answer the question for them first. The downside is time. It takes a long time to get working with government organizations. The good news is the government, capital T, capital G, is not actually monolithic. There are plenty of great people inside of the governments that are willing to work with small companies. Know that you need 3 things to work with the government. In general, you think you need 2 things. You need someone with money and someone who wants what you're selling. That seems fairly logical. Working with the government, you need a 3rd thing. A way for the government to pay you. That's the one that oftentimes takes much longer than 1 or 2. So just because you have someone that has a budget and wants what you're selling, doesn't mean they're going to be able to actually pay you. So that's one of the downsides from a small company working with the government. It takes a long time. The answer that you should put in your model is 18 months to 2 years. I know that sounds like forever. It is, but plan on it taking a long time. The upside is they're phenomenal partners. The government is a phenomenal partner, a phenomenal resource, and if you ask correctly, they can even pay you quickly and reliably. So once you're into that system, you can actually be able to count a little bit more on this government customer. And believe me, as I said at the beginning, I would love to be able to provide all of my services to you on a commercial basis, but the unfortunate part is that, at least for what we're offering today, it's just not there yet.
As a DARPA program manager, which is one of the coolest jobs I've ever had, I gotta say, I read a lot of proposals. I read a tremendous number of proposals. And for some reason, a lot of the wackier ones get vectored to me. I had one not long ago for a time machine. My response was, well, it doesn't really matter when I found it. What do we want? Time travel. What do we want? That's irrelevant. But the DARPA tries to go out of its way to make it easy to do business with us because we have an affirmative need to be a good customer and to be a good partner for the people who develop technologies that are useful in securing national defense. One of the things we do is offer what's called other transactions, which gets a lot of the barnacles of the acquisition system off the hull of and by non-force flying cars, so I'll just skip ahead and say that,
Amen.
yeah, we've, the other transaction thing helps a lot. We did an OT with you guys on, and we did one with y'all too on Alaska Phase 1. So there are limitations to what you do. You still have to do some rules and you know, dot your I's and cross your T's and stuff, but it's not quite so burdensome. Each of the tech offices at DARPA has an office broad area announcement that allows you to write, you know, a simple one-page exec summary or a white paper of a few pages and submit it. And if it's good and it's interesting to a DARPA program manager, the odds of getting funded are actually quite decent. And you know, we have money set aside for doing precisely that sort of thing. And a good chunk of it goes to companies that are first-time partners with the Defense Department. So, you know, not every part of the federal government has the charter and the infrastructure and the leadership to do that level of flexibility, but many do, and DARPA in particular does. And you know, they say that the military services should do programs that are like placing red and black bets on the roulette wheel. You know, DARPA can just say, yeah, put it all in 23 and let's see what happens. Not everything we do, but a lot of the things we do. And so we are looking for relatively high risk, high payoff opportunities. There are places in NASA, was it NIAC, which is sort of like DARPA within NASA. There's a thing called IARPA, which does things in the intelligence community. There's ARPA-E, which, you know, so the business model of DARPA, if you want to call it that, has been migrated to other parts of the federal government. If you can find one of those niches, then the odds of success increase from zero noticeably. One other thing. We don't require any equity either, just
So this was a question that I discussed with Maureen, so it's fine if you guys don't actually want to answer this one. There are obvious benefits to private equity. What are the downsides?
Ownership.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's
The beautiful setup. I appreciate that. First of all, your board member here just gave you a gold mine. Seriously, small companies. Several years ago, Maston attended this conference, and we sat around and said, "Who should we really be talking to?" And we were like, "Oh, you know, we should talk to DARPA. Be a great idea. We should do that." Several years later, we're where we are now. But seriously, and follow the instructions, because when he has to read your proposal, follow the instructions. Be creative in your solution, but not in your writing. Anyway, the question of equity. So I'll speak to Maston. I'm in a very fortunate position. We're still very closely held. It's Dave and Joel, who preceded me in the title, and are both very actively involved in the business, and both very actively involved in staying out of the way of the business. From our perspective, we're actually in really great shape. We have run the business off of revenue for many years. At some point, we will have to make that change. And one of the things we're thinking about proactively is when we take on that next group of investors, they're going to come with their ideas, their dreams, their aspirations. And we've got to make sure that we get a really good match for what they want to do and how they want to work with us to change the world. So that's kind of prospectively what we're looking at right now in terms of bringing on equity partners.
I'll just say quickly, I mean, obviously I feel incredibly fortunate to work for a company with the kind of ownership structure that we've got. We have two investors. Neither of them are technology companies, so they're very hands-off. There are also ITAR issues, so they don't even get to do a deep dive into some of the things. And we didn't have to. We're not a publicly traded company that has to be slavishly focused on the next quarter's earnings call. We have investors who are capable of looking out not just a quarter or two, but looking out a year or two, or maybe a lot more than that. And that's has clearly been the case with our investors. So I'd say it's nice work if you can get it. The main problem with equity investors traditionally has been that there aren't that many of them that are interested in our sector, but I see that changing pretty quickly. That's encouraging to me.
having been a private company previously in my life, or having run one, and sold a big chunk of it, I can say that, you reach a certain point where, you're running things off for revenue, you've got people working, you've got a building that you rented somewhere, you're making progress, but, you don't want to own 100% of nothing. So you make that compromise, and the bargain is sometimes Faustian, and Helen of Troy is generally not included on the term sheet. So, but in general, it's worth doing as long as you can protect your interests. The second company I was involved with, which wasn't on the Vita, involved a sale of the fundamental intellectual property before I hired anybody, which turned out to be really great if you can do that, but don't expect that to happen very often. In general, people who are willing to make large investments have large amounts of money, and they generally can come by it accidentally. They generally have a pretty good idea how to look after their investment. They have an idea of what works in business and what doesn't, and it is foolish not to listen to them. In general, this is the advantage of private equity, is that you get people who are wise in the ways of business helping you, and that's generally good. You generally don't want to hear it. Nobody wants to be told you should be doing this differently or that differently, but it serves you well. And I think that in the Rocketline experience, things got a lot better after substantial private equity came to the company.
So we have a little under 10 minutes for questions from the audience.
You've talked about price, you've talked about schedule, you haven't talked about what rate you're willing to blow your vehicles up at. 1 or 2%, 10%, it makes a big difference in terms of cost.
The rules of engagement on ELASA, when we wrote the proposal, was budget your failures. If you think you're going to have a 90% reliable vehicle, then I want $1 million net per flight, including the failures. So that means that if you've got to fly 110 to orbit 100, then okay, I'm going to pay for all 110. If it comes in $1 million a flight, then each individual one has to be that much less. And that allows the performer the option of trading off expensive high reliability components, for example, for more affordable components that don't have the same level of reliability, and to work that trade directly. Best engineering judgment.
We're in a position right now, I'm going to not answer, but then also answer if I can. We're looking at right now specifically two different things. There is a mission success, and then there is a loss of vehicle sort of thing. And so we are trying to make that balance right now. But I do believe that there is options in the future to be able to bring that price down. If you have the option of having the mission not be successful, but you get all the assets back and you get a second shot, that's a different paradigm. And so we're very much aware of it. I have no number to quote you and say, oh, this is what it's going to be, but it is part of the business model and part of the technical model.
It's a really good question, and to be honest, I don't think I know the exact number. I mean, I suppose no one knows until they've flown 100 flights or whatever you need to get a statistically relevant data set. I would say that there is probably a theoretical opportunity here for some company to come in and say, we've got a super high failure rate. We fail half the time, but I charge you a third of the price, so you're happy with that. That company is not us, because even though this is our satellite launch program, not our human spaceflight program, I've got pilots on the aircraft, so I've got to think about that level of safety. But also, my other half of the business is a human spaceflight, and there are big reputational risks to even if it's an uncrewed vehicle, if they're not coming home or if they're not doing their job successfully, then that probably causes some concerns on the other end of the business. But I think we'll end up at a pretty high rate of reliability. We'll see what the exact percentages work out to be.
I'm wondering if you're working up any standards in terms of payload adapters and things of that nature, because you have a variety of companies vying for these projects. So a standard board sounds like would be appropriate.
Mitchell referenced earlier the ESPA class standard and the ESPA Grande class standard as being sort of the closest thing existing to a standard. As he mentioned, our vehicle ends up right about that level, and I'd say that's no accident. So companies that have owned that before, I think will find it easy to fly with us. We're also looking at a lot of the other existing and emerging standards, or things like dispensers or CubeSats. I know there's a couple of them out there. We're trying to prevent you from being required to reinvent the wheel unless you would care to do so.
At the moment, I don't have it's a consideration, but I don't have a firm standard that's a little further down in the design criteria.
Enzo Vio, Imperial Air. See you again. We spoke a little bit at Space Tech in Long Beach. Other than cost, since everyone is driving them around, it seems like launch companies are competing on convenience in the respective market. And as Mr. Clapp said, or was alluding to, satellite companies kind of wonder why they should go with a new company over an established model. So it kind of seems like a chicken and egg problem. And with the NASA Venture Class launch contract, which was supposed last Monday, my question is, what advice do you have for new launch entrants to the market, and what other aspects can you compete on?
We're full. We don't need any more launch providers. Thank you very much.
It's a trap.
I'll say, to answer one of your underlying questions is, as you allude to and others have mentioned, you have to, Field of Dreams can work if someone believes you can actually build the field. If you have never owned any property and you don't have a gardener and you don't know the rules of baseball, probably no one's going to come to your Field of Dreams, right? So it is very important to establish some level of credibility, and that is a complex, multivariable situation that involves technical leadership, but also funding and the right framework of other stakeholders and partners. So if you don't have any idea what the FAA AST process is, or the relevant DoD processes, whatever's relevant to your world, if people start throwing out some of those, some of the regulation code numbers, and you're sort of sitting there cocking your head, then that probably is going to end poorly for you. If you can be a company of all 21-year-olds for whom this is your first job, but you're going to need really solid answers to the others of those questions if you can't say, well, I built the Falcon 1 and I built the Atlas 5, so I know, trust me, I know what you're talking about. You have to find your right mix of those things, but you probably need to check you need to check all of those boxes at least a little bit.
I'm really torn on this because I want to be encouraging. So besides my flippant answer, I want to encourage innovation, entrepreneurship. I also am well aware that there are new entrants that are coming up behind me, behind us. I will tell you that what I see oftentimes from the very early stage of, oh, rocket parts are cheap. And they're like, oh, a vehicle should cost only. Anytime I hear the word only, I know there's a problem. And a lot of times, as Will mentioned, those are folks that don't know all of the other stuff, all the old jokes about rockets fly on paperwork and all that other kind of stuff that goes into it. So I want to be encouraging. I will tell you, Virgin hasn't been at this for just a year or two. Aston has not been at this just for a year or two. Your period of jumping into this launch business may or may not be on its way to closing this particular round. There are other things. If I was starting today, I don't know, and I've said this before, Dave was brilliant and crazy to start this company. I would not be here today if he hadn't taken that crazy risk. But I don't know if I would say, I would advise him to take that risk. If we were going to go back to square one, I wouldn't say today is the day to do it in launch. I would say, look at another thing in space. There's great opportunity. The market today is different than it was 11 years ago.
Let's try and get one question. Oh, time is up, but go ahead and ask it. Let's see if we can run through it quickly.
Okay, given there's going to be this new ecosystem of companies that will be launching dozens and dozens of times every year, how are organizations like the Range Commanders Council and the FAA going to accommodate this new paradigm of vehicles that will launch not from Eastern Range or Western Range, but from potentially anywhere? And how will that affect the business operations of of these high flight rate, non-traditional vehicles?
We're working on that one. We'll get back to you soon.
Thank you for finally asking our moderator a question. Great.
So we are, at the present time, actually working on launch sites that are in the interior of the U.S. Now that necessarily limits the type of operations that can be conducted, particularly if you're going to be going over land and you don't have, or you do have a long time until you reach Louisiana and the coastline there. That's going to be very different operations, but we're actually engaged in it right now. We've already licensed 10 different spaceports, and we've got 9 right now that are pending. So we are actually in a fairly decent rhythm in regards to licensing launch sites across the U.S.
Is FAA going to back off on like launch license applications as well in terms of the time required for that?
Back off of the time frame, you mean in regards to what our time requirement is?
Yes, like if I want to launch a dozen times a year and FAA says it takes me a year to obtain a launch license, that takes away a lot of the responsiveness in one bureaucratic stroke.
I don't expect that. What I would expect is if you're actually in a process of conducting routine operations, that makes it very different in terms of the license that we can grant potentially for a block of launches, which is actually what we do right now for some of the SpaceX launches for cargo resupply to the International Space Station. So if you're making a lot of modifications in between, that will affect the time frame, but our timeline for actually getting a license review and done, we have a 180-day time frame that's on top of us, or else we have to report back to the Hill. So I think it's also very dependent in terms of, are you actually getting to the point where it's very routine operations and you've got the same method of operation? Then that's a very different game than actually what we're seeing a lot of now, which is a lot of modification in between launches, and that necessarily requires more safety analysis and inspections along the way, and it will affect the time frame.
If I may add just briefly, since I know many of you in the audience are actively involved in space advocacy, this is a chance for you to do something, help make sure that AST gets the budget commensurate with the job that they not only have today, but that is going to be increasing pretty rapidly as each of the 3 of us or our colleagues are knocking on Shannon's door and saying, please, don't take 180 days, please, and certainly don't take any longer than that.
And that's one of the things that I think we're facing in our office is we're trying to ramp up right now with staffing and our line operations to keep pace with what is happening now in regards to launch and reentry, knowing full well that maybe it's 2 years from now, it's going to bite us in the butt in terms of we're not going to be staffed up for what's coming, but there's only so much incremental change you can do in regards to how many people you bring on board into this office. So that's something that, unfortunately, I think we're going to face maybe in a couple of years time frame.
I don't think it's unfortunate you'll have to face that.
It's unfortunate only from the standpoint of the impact that it would have on actually providing launch licenses and reentry license, and that's a very serious matter for industry. So it's not necessarily staffing up our office just to staff up the office, it's the impact that it would have on operations for these guys that are sitting up here today.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks to the panel that came here today. Appreciate it. You guys were awesome.
With a conventional launch vehicle is so profoundly expensive that you would probably instead take the risk of putting many satellites on orbit all at once so that you have a hot spare ready to move in. It's a good idea, but space is not a great warehouse. The conditions are harsh, and your satellites that are spares are going to suffer the same degradation as the ones that are operational. So in the long run, ALAS is there in part to make the access to space so routine and flexible that the rideshare of the future is, here, have an Alaska, go away, you bother me, on the part of primary payload providers, rather than having to do more complicated things and longer and more detailed business arrangements.
Sean, you're obviously developing your vehicle specifically for the DARPA program, XS1. What are you envisioning in terms of ability to use this vehicle for in the future on the commercial side of the equation? And also, was wondering from the DARPA perspective with the ALASA program, have you guys been having discussions? Obviously, from a defense standpoint, you need access to space on demand and from locations that are not just East Coast, West Coast ranges. Have you started thinking about the commercial applications beyond that? And so maybe Sean start.
Sure. So the first piece of that, this is the first time that and the first time our organization has picked up a DARPA program of this nature. So when I talk history, I have to trust the people that have told me the history. From a historical standpoint, the objective in the XS1 program was to limit all of the conditions that have to be, try to make it as wide open as possible design space. And so the first piece of that is it's allowing us to come up with a creative solution. When we look at the business case for this DARPA program, our plan is day one launch capability. Now, day one doesn't mean...
The fastest growing segment of the market is the small end of the launch mass spectrum. And the primary goal of the ALASA program is to reduce the cost of space access to $1 million per flight. That's very aggressive. We have to do a lot of very different things to make that happen. Have to develop automatic flight termination systems, space-based telemetry. We have to do an almost automated orbital object collision avoidance analysis, which is a profoundly difficult project. I don't care which object I'm not going to be hit as long as I don't hit it. So we have to develop some substantially new ways of doing business. But the payoff is exactly as Will described it. We first started an air-launched space launch vehicle in 1990 with Pegasus, and since then, roughly 15 generations of Moore's Law have passed. I think you could make a persuasive case that a 100-pound satellite today is as or more capable as a 1,000-pound satellite was when Pegasus was brand new. Maybe not, the apertures don't scale the way electronics do, and you could quibble over it, but I think you can have a good conversation on that subject. So ALASA is there to simplify the entire access to space problem to, one instrument, one bus, one launch, one orbit, not that many people in the room, and right now on ride shares, the administrative costs alone of additional coupled loads analyses and so forth arguably exceed $1 million per flight. Someone bears those costs. Sometimes it's the primary payload provider who offers rideshare opportunities as a service to the community, to foster new technology, to invest in people. But in general, it's not something they prefer to be bothered with. And of course, if the primary payload runs late or gets heavy, the rideshare stuff gets booted, which is a profound risk to take when your program, and particularly when your business plan, depends on timely access to space. Additionally, there is no affordable way to launch just one small satellite. When you have a constellation of satellites up in space, your business plan will in the long run depend on maintaining that constellation. Satellites will break. To replace a single satellite alone...
Those guys should have no fear that XS1 is going to be launching really big things. Again, we're looking at that small to medium size of the market, but just knowing that that is there will then allow a lot more flexibility to both commercial and to government customers. So that's the big, I think, change that the XS1 program and our solution will provide. It also opens up a couple other options because of the fact that your vertical takeoff and vertical landing, it has a lot of flexibility to be able to go to different places and launch and land in different places. And so that opens up, perhaps as you look at the extension beyond the DARPA program, we're looking at the fact that there will be more options to get where it is you need to go in the future. So, and to the question of how is it superior, is offering an additional tool in the toolbox.
I suspect all of our answers may be somewhat similar on this, and I believe Maureen's probably would have as well if she were here. I think we're all trying to find the exact Goldilocks zone of what is the right combination of things here. To sort of echo what Sean said, there are a lot of great launch vehicles on the market already. Someone in the room could tell me, I'm sure, but yesterday was the 20-somethingest consecutive success for Atlas V. We've seen a lot of other great track records, even if there have been some recent blips. For the most part, there are great rockets on the market that work quite well, that have a price point that has proven reasonable for a fairly large block of customers. But I think what we're trying to tackle is something fundamentally different, and we're trying to serve a group of customers that haven't particularly been well served, largely because a few years ago they didn't exist. We are, what makes us a good fit, I think, for an alternative launch vehicle panel. You could say, well, we're not vertical takeoff and landing, we're not doing aerospike, we don't have this awesome zoom climb maneuver, our vehicle looks more traditional in a lot of senses. What is alternative about it is that it is commercially developed for a commercial audience. I'm sure we'll happily sell to the US government if they want to buy it on commercial terms, but we're not developing this launch vehicle for a government development program, and we're not developing it primarily to service the government. We are developing to service entrepreneurs. We do that. We remain incredibly focused on what our commercial customers desire. So that's my quick stats update.
Thank you, and I'm going to mix it up a little bit. On my first question, I'm going to go to you, Sean, first, and then Will, and then over to Mitch. So the first question is, how is your vehicle going to revolutionize the status quo of access to space, and why do you believe your alternative approach is superior to traditional methods?
Could be superior. And I want to make sure, right out of the gate, we're in a design phase. This may change the whole world, and because of the fact that it might change the world, it's worth doing. So how will a Mastin XS1 vehicle change that market? The idea of a vehicle that can fly, a single airframe that can fly 10 times in 10 days is a game changer. If it is as simple, and it's never this simple, if it is as simple as gas and go, and perhaps reloading an upper stage, and being able to hit a pace of operation that is significantly different from anything that we have today. That, I think, is going to be the big change. And what it will do, even if we're not launching 3,000 pounds to orbit 10 times in 10 days, just the fact that that capacity and capability would exist at the successful completion of an XS1 program, whether it's us or anybody else, if that capability is successfully demonstrated, it then changes the math for how far in advance you might have to plan to get your assets on orbit. It will change the math, and so that's the thing that we're looking at, and how that will change the launch industry. We are not going to be doing big heavy lift, so there will still be, if the big heavy
Entrepreneurial companies, I'm happy to always have an excuse to come here to San Jose, to Silicon Valley, because this is where a lot of our customers live. Many of these are customers that were born a few years ago when the community was sort of enamored of the Falcon 1, and then when the Falcon 1 and Falcon 1E retired, found themselves looking for a launch vehicle. Others of these companies are brand new. The paint is still drying on the sign on the front door. But one thing that unites them is they are building smaller spacecraft, and they want to launch them a lot more frequently because they want today's technology in orbit, not last decade's technology in orbit. And what a lot of them have found is that secondary launch opportunities, and maybe even doing a massive bundle and buying a Falcon 9 or another large launch vehicle, works really well for the case of demonstrating technology. It works really poorly for the case of building out a business plan. Sort of the analogy that I draw is people call secondary launch opportunities hitchhiking, and it turns out hitchhiking to space is a lot like hitchhiking here on Earth. You don't get to pick exactly when you leave, you don't get to choose exactly where you get dropped off, you don't get to choose what route you take. There's lots of rules about what you can and cannot do in the car. And if you're 21 years old and just trying to see America, that's probably fine. If you have somewhere you need to be and a time you need to get there, that probably doesn't work for you. You need something much more akin to calling an Uber and getting to leave when you want to leave and getting to arrive exactly when you want to arrive. And that's really what we are trying to develop. Make it so that companies that have been flying as a hitchhiker can all of a sudden be the driver of the car, can pick the orbital destination, can pick the launch site, can get out of the single file line that Mitch described very eloquently, and don't have to pay an exorbitant premium in order to do so, pay about the rates that they're familiar with paying on secondary launch vehicles. I think once we do that, that is really an enabling technology for all the cool companies like you see here in the Bay Area, your Planet Labs, your Skyboxes, your Spires, all the other ones that are, many of whom are here in the audience. I think all of their business plans do get supercharged when they all of a sudden get a lot more ownership and authority over their right to space.